Hello and welcome to Codex Lee. My name is Lee and this is a channel all about books. So welcome back after quite a long break. So lockdown has been weird, hasn't it? We've been very fortunate here in New Zealand in that life has mostly returned to normal now. I don't think it's ever going to be entirely normal for the foreseeable future, but we've been very lucky and I'm very grateful for that. You know, and because now things are kind of returning to normal for me, despite the fact that I'm still working from home, our business has asked us to keep working from home for the time being, I thought it was a good time to talk about what I have been reading. I've actually not had a huge amount of spare time despite being locked down. I've been working full-time from home, and if anything, there have been large stretches of time during lockdown where I've been working more intensely than usual. But I've tried to read as much as I can, and I want to talk about what I read in March and April of this year. I previously talked about what I read in the first 2 months of the year, and I'll put a link to that video up above if you'd like to watch that. So I've been tracking my reading during the course of the year, and I realised, a few weeks in, that everything I was reading was by a male author. And I wanted to correct that, so I started to, consciously try to read more works by women. There are many different ways, of course, we can be conscious of the diversity of the reading material that we're getting through. But at the very least, I thought it's not okay that I'm just reading books by guys. So the first book I want to talk about is this, which is History of the Indians of the United States, and this is by Angie Debo. This is a wonderful volume from the Folio Society with a fantastic cover. Angie Debo herself does not have Native American ancestry, but she had been researching Native American history for decades prior to writing this. So this is in many ways a pioneering work, and she was a pioneering researcher. Her story is quite interesting. You get a glimpse of her story in the introduction to this piece, which emphasises not just how important this volume was, but how difficult it was for her to get recognition as a serious scholar. And it was only much later in life that really she received that recognition and made enormous contributions to Native American rights. She spoke before Congress, and really she put this book together because she delivered a series of lectures on Native American history, and she was encouraged by her students to pull all of that together into a book. So she did. It's a fairly substantial volume, but it reads very well. It was written for broader public, and it sold very well at the time. I really enjoyed this. I did not know very much about Native American history prior to reading this book, and I learned a lot about many of the great injustices, the massacres that occurred, some of which I'd kind of maybe vaguely had heard the name before, but never the details, and they're very grim, disturbing details. It's made me interested in reading much more about Native American history. So it's a very important book. It's one I really enjoyed, and it is in a wonderful volume that I just saw by chance, I think, when I was browsing a second-hand bookshop. So I gave this 4 stars, and if you were at all interested in Native American history and you want to read a landmark volume that covers that history right up to the time this was written in 1970, then do find a copy of Angie Debo's book. Next, I read Difficult Women, A History of Feminism in 11 Fights by Helen Lewis. I listened to this on Audible. It was narrated by Helen Lewis. Helen Lewis is a journalist. She writes for The Atlantic. She was previously, I think, deputy editor for the New Statesman magazine, which is a left-leaning political magazine published in the UK. I followed Helen Lewis for a while on Twitter. She is a voice that I respect. She is a voice of moderation. I don't want to talk too much about the politics of this. There has been a very fierce, polarised debate in the UK, as there have been in other countries, about transgender rights. And Helen Lewis wrote about this a few years ago, and there was a tremendous backlash to the viewpoints that she took. She withdrew in large part from Twitter as a result of that backlash. She does discuss that briefly in the book, and I think this is one of the strengths of the book. She brings parts of her experiences to this history. Many of the women she writes about in this history I had never heard of before, There is a big chapter on the suffragettes, and she writes in particular the kind of class divisions within the suffragettes, how there were different groups of suffragettes from different classes of society, and some of the tensions between those different groups. Really, the premise of this book is that history is not made by nice women, it is made by difficult women. There is a tendency today to sanitize the history of many pioneers of equal rights, when in fact the lived history of many of these people who have brought about great positive changes for groups of people is messy. Their lives are messy. Some of the things that they said and did, many people would find objectionable. But that doesn't override the fact that they had still done something, done a tremendous good. And she writes also about, I think, how many of the rights that people have, women have in particular, she's writing about here, are taken for granted, and how many of these rights were won in relatively recent times. And it's quite often the case that when those rights are won, people quite quickly forget how difficult it was to win those rights in the first place. So I think it's important to chronicle those two aspects of the history of equal rights and women's rights in particular, in that many of these people who fought for these rights are not particularly likable, and they are difficult, and also that we shouldn't forget how difficult it was to win these rights in the first place as well. I think I give this 4 stars as well. I really enjoyed this. I really liked the mix of Helen Luce's own personal history and personal experiences together with what she had discovered in researching this history, and even touching sometimes on, I guess, the process of research itself is fascinating. I highly recommend it. I guess a book that I also read over the last couple of months that is similar in some ways and very different in other ways is a book called Rocking the Boat, Welsh Women Who Championed Equality, 1840 to 1990. This is by Angie V. John. Unlike Helen Lewis, Angie V. John is an academic. She works within academia, and she personally knew at least one of the women that she writes about here. She writes about, I think, about half a dozen different women. So similar to Difficult Women, she's writing brief biographies of these different figures and the contributions that they made to equality, not just women's rights, but other types of equality as well. And the difference with Difficult Women is that this is a more scholarly approach to the material. That doesn't mean that it's inaccessible. She's not writing with obtuse language. It's readable. It's definitely readable. But she's bringing less of her own experience, I suppose, and it doesn't read quite as easily as Difficult Women. But I enjoyed this. This is one of the books I was reading as part of my reading project over the first 6 months of the year. I wanted to read the books with the most number of reviews on my Goodreads TBR and the books with the least number of reviews on my Goodreads TBR. And this is one of the ones that had the least number of reviews. And I've been trying to write reviews of the books with the least number of reviews as I've read them. So I did write a review of this in Goodreads, and I'll put a link to that down below if you want to read it. But as I note in that review, most of the women in this book, in fact all the women in this book, their association with Wales is complicated. There aren't many books, if any books at all aside from this one, that are about Welsh women. And as Angie V. John notes, that's because Welsh women of prominence, particularly as you go further back in history, they may not have remained within Wales. So many of these women were born in Wales but moved away, or some of them might have had Welsh heritage and some kind of close sort of emotional connection to Wales, if you like. One of them, Edith Picton Turberville, she was the first Welsh woman to become a Labour MP. Another one, Lady Rhondda, she held the woman who held the most directorships in the UK in the 1920s. She was also the first female president of the Institute of Directors. And Frances Hogan, who's another woman Angie V. John writes about, was the first female British doctor to gain her MD in Europe. I'm very glad I read this. I had never heard of these women before, but it was really good to read, and it was good to read this after reading Difficult Women, because many of these women Angie V. John writes about were kind of quote-unquote difficult too, and it was interesting to think of them and of their lives and their accomplishments, having read Difficult Women and appreciating what they'd done despite some of the views they held. I mean, Frances Hogan had some, you know, troubling views on eugenics, for instance. But again, it just reminds us that many of these women who, you know, achieved great things are not always necessarily likable or relatable, but they don't need to be. So I was divided between giving this 3 stars and 4 stars. In the end, I give it 4 stars because I feel like it's an important work, and I guess it means something more to me to read about Welsh women in particular, as, you know, coming from Wales myself and reading this history. I'm trying to read more Welsh history, so that was really good. Also, the past couple of months I read The Templars by Dan Jones. I was really excited to read this because I wanted some kind of great epic, very readable history of a subject that I really didn't know very much about. I don't know much about the Templars. Most of what I know about the Templars is from playing Broken Sword when I was a teenager. Which is probably not the most accurate history. It took me a long time to read this. I read it as an ebook over many weeks, and it was a bit of a slog. I actually didn't find the history of the Templars as fascinating as I thought that I would. I just kept thinking throughout, why are they there? Why are they there? What business do they have being there? The stuff I found really fascinating was towards the end of the book, the kind of the collapse of the Templars and the sort of political intrigue that really brought them down. I thought that was really interesting, far more than the various different battles that they fought in the Middle East. And, you know, most of this book focuses on their presence in the Middle East, understandably. But again, I thought that many of the forces opposed against them were more interesting than the Templars themselves. I think I just wasn't as interested in this topic as I was hoping to be. But that's not to discredit the book in any way. If you think that the history of the Templars is something that might interest you, then do read this book. I'm sure that you'll enjoy it. For me, it was more of a kind of a 3-star book. It took me quite a while to get through it. I'm glad that I did, but maybe I just need to choose my histories more carefully. I don't know. The last 2 books I want to talk about, I guess I'll talk about them as a pair because they're part of the trilogy. I've been rereading his Dark Materials, so I read The Subtle Knife and The Amber Spyglass by Philip Pullman. And I really enjoyed reading these 2. I mean, I really enjoyed rereading Northern Lights recently. I read that, I think, just before Christmas time. But I enjoyed these 2 more. I think the more he brings in these ideas that he's exploring around, you know, theology, around quantum physics, I suppose, the nature of reality, of good and evil. I think it's really clever the way that he kind of introduces you to those sort of concepts of the first book. But the first book, Northern Lights, is much more of I guess, a traditional children's fantasy tale with some kind of differences that kind of creep in. But then he really brings in more of these ideas into the second and particularly the third book, and they're just so readable. You know, I just kind of flew through them. Even though The Amber Spyglass is quite a big book, it must be about 500 pages, whereas The Subtle Knife is nearly half the size, I think. They're highly readable. You know, the characters are great. The story is great, but for me it just made me excited about ideas and about science in a way that I haven't felt for quite some time, and I'm really excited to go and read more science books, actually, more non-fiction. And it was great to be back in this world, and to be back in the real world of the real Oxford as well. I've spent some time in Oxford in the past, and I really like Oxford, and it was nice to be reminded of that particular place. And to be reminded of the time that I previously read these books, actually. So that's it from me, a gentle reintroduction to BookTube. 6 books in 2 months, not too bad. May has not been great in terms of my reading, but I'm hoping June will be better. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do give it a like. Please subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate everybody who watches and comments. If you've read these books, tell me what you think. And take care, look after yourselves, and I will see you guys hopefully very soon.